Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm actually the Quack, and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. This is Ramblings of the Mad Duck. So I just need to state this now. I recorded this before the Primus voiceover dialogue was released on Wowhead. So overall, this recording is dated in a few areas, and one of the details I don't really touch on throughout this content is how the disappearance of the Primus may have been the reason why the House of Eyes started to look into the Legion. So, today's topic is going to be Afterlives Maldraxxus. And, this was an interesting one. I mean, to be perfectly clear, I do think Afterlives Bastion was more interesting and more impactful than Afterlives Maldraxxus. However, the fact Blizzard basically had to reintroduce Draka, set up Maldraxxus, and tell an interesting story in the time frame that they had, I can't understand why the short overall seems kind of disjointed in general. Now, the overall in-your-face plot of Afterlives Maldraxxus is interesting. It tells the story of Draka and basically her experiences with Shadowlands, and how she basically ended up a Baroness. But what's really interesting, though, is the subplot and the subtle implications in this animatic, because first time round you can barely pick them up, but the second time round when you watch it and you pick them up, it's like, oh, that's clever. What am I talking about? So similar to Afterlives Bastion, the interesting aspect of this entire animatic comes down to one specific scene. That scene is where Draka is seemingly infiltrating a Legion stronghold. And the reason why is that, as a lot of people have pointed out, there is this one specific panel that is identical to a panel in the Illidari animatic. And the initial reaction I've seen a lot of people have is, oh, laziness on Blizzard's part. And I mean, it could be, but when you consider the fact that Draka died incredibly early in World of Warcraft's like overall timeline in comparison to when the Illidari turn up, it's highly likely Draka infiltrated that stronghold as it was invading the planet. Meaning, what we're seeing in Afterlives Maldraxxus is what that planet was before the Legion was finished with it. And when we see it in the Illidari animatic, we see what the planet turned up like. And yeah, stark difference to say the very least. But anyway, this entire scene seems to imply the House of Eyes was spying on Legion. Now the question for this is why, especially when you consider what the Archon said in Afterlives Bastion. As in, the Shadowlands seems to be rather insular. So the fact that the House of Eyes was spying on the Legion seems to imply they either were at war with the Legion, knew the Legion was going to become a threat and come after the Shadowlands, or there was something else. That something else, considering what Maldraxxus' purpose is, most likely had something to do with the Jailer. And I think this entire animatic basically implies the reason why Maldraxxus is in the state it is, and why it's basically been attacked. I think Margrave Akarek, the leader of the House of Eyes and Draka's mentor, had figured out something was going on in the Maw, and that something had been going on for a very, very long time. Why? It's the general timeline that we're kind of given and implied throughout this entire Afterlives Maldraxxus. Because obviously the House of Spies would have been investigating the Legion prior to Draka arriving, or at least you would have assumed so. And then, during the start of this entire animatic, Draka basically says, it's kind of weird that a warrior has been chosen to enter the House of Eyes as a spy. As in, why would you train a warrior as a spy? But then you've got to consider that Draka isn't just a warrior, she's an orc. Specifically a fel-exposed orc. As in, she's green because of her exposure to the orcs that drank the blood of Manaroth. So in one way, shape or form, her soul likely has a bit of fel lingering on it. And I think this is specifically why Akarek chose Draka. I think he saw an opportunity to start investigating what was going on with the Legion. And I think it's rather ironic that just after she takes the map and it's kind of implied that she's been fighting the Legion, that she says that she finally started to fit in. As in, she's basically fighting the same forces that killed her. I mean, technically, she wouldn't have known that, because she died long before the Legion was revealed to be the masters of the fel-infused orcs, but I think it's a nice touch. Anyway, I think Draka and the House of Eyes are investigating the Legion for years, and they may have started to finally creep up on the Jailer's involvement with the Legion. And I think the thing that tipped off Akarek to the Legion's involvement with Undeath, or the Shadowlands in general, was because of the Orc Necrolites that only existed because Kil'jaeden told Gul'dan how to make them. So once again, if you've watched Nathrazim Conspiracy, there's a connection with Kil'jaeden and Undeath and the Shadowlands. I think this investigation started to lead Akarek to the Maw, hence why I think it was a blue post or it was a Wowhead article. Basically, there are NPCs from the House of Eyes in the Maw, as in I'm pretty sure they're just supposed to be observers spying on the Maw, but for that to be the case means either one of two things. Either A, they're basically suicide units that were meant to just watch the Maw for eternity, or Akarek sent them in a lot later on, probably just before his death, and he had figured out that the Maw wasn't an inescapable hellhole. But basically, Maldraxxus and the House of Eyes doing what it's supposed to do probably started to realize that the Maw wasn't as quiet as it was supposed to be, and may have noticed the missing Helm of Domination and Frostmourne, or at the very least suspected they had been missing, but might have actually been stopped by the House of Rituals. Because what's interesting about this is that before Akarek dies, like the explosion of the Necropolis, he sends Lady Vash, another one of his agents, to start investigating the House of Rituals, because they suspect that they're in league with the Jailer, and they obviously turn out to be. And all of that seems to have a relation to Kel'Thuzad, as in the reason why the House of Rituals has fallen is because KT got in their ranks. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you consider the timeline, Akarek already suspected the Maw prior to the Lich King, KT, and all of that stuff happening. But it still happened. So if I was to guess, one of the first things the Jailer did or wanted after getting the Helm of Domination Frostmourne out was to try and figure out a way to stop the House of Eyes from investigating. So he likely used KT. Because what's rather weird about KT is that, okay, so the first time he dies and like in life, all of that makes perfect sense. But when he dies, that's when things get weird. Because KT has been in the Shadowlands for a while, or it seems like he's been in the Shadowlands for a while. But the fact that he was needed to be resurrected by the Sunwell specifically, at least to me, implies that after he died, he specifically ascended to a powerful position within the Shadowlands almost instantly. So, if I was to guess, the first time KT died, somehow, some way, he probably ended up in Maldraxxus and in the House of Rituals. And I mean, I'm not sure how many traitors are within Maldraxxus. I don't have access to beta, so you know. But what's interesting is that if Devos had already fallen by this time, then how KT got into Maldraxxus actually makes a lot of sense. As in, after Devos had kind of started to fall and create the Forsworn, she used her position as the paragon of loyalty to get KT into Maldraxxus. Hell, it may have been a loyalty test. I don't know. From there, KT sets things in motion. He doesn't do anything because he gets called back, as in he gets resurrected by the Sunwell, helps Arthas, etc., does his stuff while Lich King's asleep, after he disappears the second time. So, after we defeat him in Wrath, probably went back and everything had probably been in place. So, basically halfway through Afterlives Maldraxxus, we kind of get a time skip. And that's when KT finally starts to enact his plan, as in he blows up the House of Plagues, blows up the House of Spies, and basically manages to shut down Maldraxxus that was probably on the verge of figuring out what was going on, and was probably going to do something, or at least warn the other Covenants about what was going on. And how Draka fits into all this is, I think, as time went on, or possibly just from the very beginning, Akarek chose to use Draka as the quote-unquote chosen one to stop whatever was going on in Maldraxxus, and possibly the Maw. To also add an interesting observation, Draka fits a very interesting trend when it comes to certain characters that seem to have involvement with the Shadowlands. What I mean by this is, Ysera, born weakly, sickly, yet weakly sickly, yet becomes the Dreamweaver and eventually ends up in Ardenweald. Draka, same thing, born sickly, exiled from the Frostwolves, would have died, but ended up in the Shadowlands. And then there's Gul'dan, and once again, if you've watched what's the name? Nathrezim Conspiracy, you'll know what I'm talking about. But basically, considering Gul'dan's condition in life and everything that's going on in his life, there is a very, very real chance that his entire life got screwed over by the jailer and may have been manipulated by the jailer. As in, everything that kind of happened in relation to the orcs may have had something to do with Gul'dan and being cursed. Cursed by the jailer and or just death in general. But yeah, overall, Afterlives Maldraxxus seems to imply the Shadowlands, the Maw, the Legion, the jailer, Sargeras, or at the very least Kil'jaeden, have had connections to each other since before Warcraft 3, and considering the timeline, quite possibly longer. And it seems as if the House of Eyes had started to investigate and eventually started to figure out how these two forces were connected. And I think overall, other than explaining the basic story of Draka, also implies Margrave Akarek chose Draka to be the one to fight against this union of the Legion and the Maw, or at the very least be the one to stop whatever conspiracy was transpiring in the Shadowlands. Thank you for watching.